The smell of barbecue sauce and grilled meat filled the air as I walked into Smokey Joe's restaurant, clutching the signed purchase agreement in my trembling hands. My father's voice from 3 hours earlier still echoed in my mind. "Rachel, you're 32 years old and you can't even afford a decent car. When are you going to get your life together?" Little did he know that in just a few hours I'd be writing a check for $2 million to buy the very restaurant where he'd just humiliated me in front of our entire extended family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The day started like any other family gathering, with my mother frantically texting everyone about arriving on time and my father already complaining about the restaurant choice before we'd even sat down. Smokey Joe's had been our family's go-to spot for celebrations for over 15 years. The rustic wooden tables, mason jar lighting, and walls covered in vintage license plates had witnessed countless birthdays, anniversaries, and graduations. Today was supposed to be my cousin Marcus's engagement party, but it quickly turned into another episode of The Harold Brennan Show. I pulled up to the restaurant in my 2018 Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving since my divorce 3 years ago. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable and paid off, something I'd learned to value after watching my ex-husband drown us in debt with his luxury car obsession. As I walked through the parking lot, I noticed my father's brand new BMW gleaming in the afternoon sun, parked strategically where everyone could see it. The hostess, a young woman with bright purple hair named Destiny, greeted me with a warm smile. "You must be with the Brennan party. They're already seated on the back patio." She led me through the dimly lit restaurant, past the bar where a few regulars nursed their afternoon beers, and out to the covered patio where my family had claimed their usual spot. "There she is," my Aunt Patricia called out, waving me over with her rhinestone-encrusted hand. "Rachel, honey, you look wonderful. Come sit by me." I hugged my way around the table, exchanging pleasantries with cousins I saw maybe twice a year, and dodging questions about my love life from well-meaning relatives. My father sat at the head of the table, naturally, wearing his favorite polo shirt and that expression he got when he was gearing up to hold court. My mother, Linda, sat beside him, already looking apologetic for whatever was about to come out of his mouth. "So, Rachel," my father began, cutting into his brisket with theatrical precision, "your mother tells me you're still living in that little apartment downtown. When are you planning to buy a house like a normal person your age?" The table fell silent, except for the scraping of silverware against plates. My cousin Marcus, the guest of honor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fiancée, a sweet woman named Ashley who'd only met our family twice, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. "I'm comfortable where I am, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The apartment is in a great location and I'm saving money." "Saving money?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For what? You drive a car that's older than some of the kids at this table? You work at that little accounting firm making, what, $40,000 a year? Rachel, you're 32 years old and you can't even afford a decent car. When are you going to get your life together?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as every eye at the table turned toward me. My cousin Jennifer, who'd never worked a day in her life thanks to her trust fund, suddenly found her salad fascinating. Uncle Bob cleared his throat awkwardly and mumbled something about the weather. "Harold," my mother said quietly, "this isn't the time." "When is the time, Linda?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "She's our daughter, and she's wasting her life. Look at Marcus here. He's 28, owns his own business, just bought a house, and now he's getting married. What does Rachel have to show for herself?" I wanted to tell him about the consulting business I'd been building on the side for the past 2 years. I wanted to explain how I'd been deliberately living below my means, saving and investing every spare dollar. I wanted to mention the 6-figure portfolio I'd accumulated through careful planning and smart investments. But I'd learned long ago that trying to defend myself to Harold Brennan was like trying to reason with a brick wall. Instead, I excused myself and headed to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect myself. The restaurant's restroom was small but clean, with vintage advertisements covering the walls. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. The woman looking back at me had worked 60-hour weeks for 3 years, rebuilding her life from scratch after a messy divorce. She'd gone back to school at night to get her CPA license. She'd sacrificed social outings and designer clothes to build something stable and secure. When I returned to the table, the conversation had mercifully moved on to Marcus's wedding plans. I sat quietly, picking at my pulled pork sandwich while my family discussed venue options and guest lists. But my father wasn't done with me yet. "You know what your problem is, Rachel," he said during a lull in the conversation. "You have no ambition. You're content to just get by, to be mediocre. That's not how I raised you." "Dad, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm serious. Look around this table. Everyone here has made something of themselves. Jennifer just got promoted to senior marketing director. Marcus owns 3 food trucks. Even your cousin Danny, who flunked out of college twice, managed to start his own landscaping company. But you're stuck in the same dead-end job, the same tiny apartment, driving the same beat-up car. The worst part wasn't just the humiliation. It was the knowing looks from my relatives. Some seemed embarrassed for me. Others appeared to agree with my father's assessment. My Aunt Patricia tried to change the subject by asking about Marcus's bachelor party plans, but my father was on a roll. "You want to know what I think?" he continued, pointing his fork at me. "I think you're scared. Scared to take risks. Scared to fail. Scared to actually try for something better. You've gotten comfortable being broke and unsuccessful." That word, broke, hung in the air like smoke from the restaurant's wood-fired grill. I felt something shift inside me. A quiet resolve that had been building for months, suddenly crystallizing into action. I'd been planning to wait another year before making my move, to save even more money and reduce the risk. But sitting there, listening to my father's assessment of my life, I realized that some opportunities don't wait for perfect timing. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. James Morrison, the owner of Smoky Joe's, had mentioned last month that he was thinking about selling. He was getting older, his kids had no interest in the restaurant business, and he was tired of the daily grind. We'd struck up a conversation one evening when I was dining alone, and he'd mentioned he was testing the waters with a few potential buyers. "Excuse me," I said, standing up from the table. "I need to make a phone call." I walked back into the restaurant, my heart pounding as I dialed James's number. He answered on the second ring. "James, it's Rachel Brennan. We spoke last month about your interest in selling the restaurant." I paused, watching my family through the window as they continued their meal, oblivious to what I was about to do. "I'd like to make an offer." The conversation that followed was surreal. James had been hoping to get $2 million for the restaurant, including the building, equipment, and existing lease agreements with his suppliers. He'd been in business for 22 years and had built a loyal customer base, but the day-to-day operations were wearing him down. He was ready to move to Florida and spend his retirement fishing. "I can have the money available by tomorrow," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like to close as soon as possible." "Rachel, are you sure about this? Running a restaurant isn't easy. It's 7 days a week. Early mornings, late nights. The margins are thin, and you're always one bad review away from losing customers." I looked out at the patio, where my father was still holding court, probably moving on to criticize someone else's life choices. "James, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." We agreed to meet the next morning to discuss the details. I hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, letting the magnitude of what I'd just done sink in. In less than 24 hours, I was about to become the owner of a $2 million restaurant. The same restaurant where my father had just told me I was broke and unsuccessful. When I returned to the table, my family was discussing dessert options. My father was debating between the chocolate cake and the peach cobbler, as if the most important decision of his day was which sugar-laden treat to consume. I sat down and smiled politely as the conversation continued around me, but my mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's meeting. "You're awfully quiet over there, Rachel," my mother observed. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just thinking about some business matters." My father snorted. "Business matters? What business?" "You work for someone else, doing their books and filing their taxes." "That's not business, that's just a job." I nodded and smiled, cutting into my key lime pie. "You're right, Dad. It is just a job. But that might be changing soon." He raised an eyebrow but didn't pursue the topic, probably assuming I was talking about applying for a different position at another accounting firm. If only he knew that by this time tomorrow, I'd be signing papers to become the owner of the very establishment where he'd just spent the last hour tearing down my life choices. As we finished our meal and prepared to leave, I took one last look around Smoky Joe's. The afternoon crowd was thinning out, but the dinner rush would start soon. I wondered what it would feel like to walk through these doors tomorrow as the owner instead of just another customer. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. My father paid the check with his usual fanfare, making sure everyone noticed him pulling out his American Express black card. "Another lovely meal at Smoky Joe's," he announced. "It's too bad the ownership doesn't seem to care about updating the decor. This place could use some fresh blood, someone with vision and capital to really make it shine." I almost laughed out loud at the irony. If everything went according to plan, he'd get his wish for new ownership sooner than he thought. And that fresh blood would be coming from the daughter he'd just spent the afternoon calling broke and unsuccessful. The drive home from Smoky Joe's felt surreal. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my Honda Civic as I replayed the conversation with James Morrison over and over in my mind. $2 million. In less than 18 hours, I would be transferring that amount from my investment accounts to purchase the restaurant where my father had just humiliated me. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd criticized my beat-up car while sitting in an establishment I was about to own. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I pulled into my apartment complex on Maple Street, a modest 3-story building that had become my sanctuary after the divorce. The units weren't luxurious, but they were clean, well-maintained, and most importantly, they allowed me to save nearly 60% of my income. While my father saw this as evidence of my failure, I saw it as strategic planning. Every dollar I hadn't spent on an impressive address or a flashy car had been carefully invested in a diversified portfolio that now totaled just over $3 million. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Honey, don't let your father get to you. He means well, but he doesn't always express himself kindly. Love you." I smiled despite myself. Linda Brennan had spent 35 years running interference for her husband's tactless comments, and she'd gotten quite good at it. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, past Mrs. Chen's door where the aroma of her famous dumplings drifted into the hallway. The building might not have impressed my father, but it housed some of the most interesting people I'd ever met. There was Dr. Rodriguez, a retired professor who spoke 4 languages and grew prize-winning orchids on his balcony. Maria Santos, a single mother of 2 who was putting herself through nursing school while working nights at the hospital. These were people who understood the value of sacrifice in pursuit of something greater. My apartment was small but efficient, a living room that doubled as my home office, a compact kitchen where I'd learned to cook elaborate meals for one, and a bedroom that faced east so I could wake up to natural light. The furniture was simple but comfortable, chosen for function rather than status. My father would have called it depressing, but I called it intentional. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. The financial documents I needed were all stored securely in the cloud: bank statements, investment portfolios, credit reports, and tax returns. Over the past 3 years, I'd built something remarkable from the wreckage of my marriage. My ex-husband Derek had left me with nothing but debt and a damaged credit score. He'd spent our money on expensive toys and risky investments, always chasing the next big score while I begged him to think about our future. The divorce had been ugly. Derek's lawyer had argued that I deserved nothing because I'd been just a housewife during our marriage, ignoring the fact that I'd worked part-time while putting him through graduate school. But I'd learned something valuable from that experience. The only person I could truly count on was myself. So I'd gone back to work full-time, earned my CPA license through night school, and started building a life that no one could take away from me. My consulting business had started almost by accident. Sarah Williams, a colleague at Morrison & Associates, had mentioned that her brother-in-law needed help with his construction company's books. One client led to another, and before I knew it, I was working evenings and weekends for small business owners who couldn't afford big accounting firms. The money was good, But more importantly, it taught me how businesses actually operated, their cash flows, their challenges, their opportunities. I'd always been fascinated by restaurants. Maybe it was because food brought people together. Or maybe it was the complex logistics of managing inventory, staff, and customer satisfaction simultaneously. Whatever the reason, I'd done extensive research on the restaurant industry over the past year. I knew the failure rates, the profit margins, the seasonal fluctuations. I'd even taken a course on restaurant management through the local community college, telling myself it was just intellectual curiosity. But deep down, I'd been preparing for this moment, the moment when opportunity would present itself, and I'd have to decide whether to play it safe or take the leap. James Morrison had mentioned wanting to sell on a Thursday evening in March. I'd been dining alone at Smoky Joe's, as had become my habit when I needed to think. The restaurant was quieter on weeknights, and I enjoyed watching the staff work together like a well-oiled machine. James had stopped by my table to ask how the salmon was, and we'd ended up talking for nearly an hour about the challenges of running a restaurant. 22 years I've been doing this, he'd said, sinking into the chair across from me. Started when I was 28, about your age. Thought I'd retire by 50. But here I am at 56, still working 60-hour weeks. I'd asked him what he'd do differently if he could start over. His answer stayed with me. I'd find a partner, someone younger, with fresh ideas and the energy to handle the day-to-day operations. This business will drain you if you try to do everything yourself. Now, sitting in my apartment with my laptop open, I realized that conversation had been more than casual chat. James had been testing the waters, seeing if I might be interested in getting involved. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more ironic. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my sister Kelly's name. She lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids, blissfully removed from the Brennan family drama. "Rachel, Mom told me about dinner today. Are you okay?" Kelly was 5 years younger than me, but she'd always been the peacemaker in our family. She'd inherited our mother's diplomatic nature rather than our father's confrontational streak. "I'm fine, Kel. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm about to do something that's going to shock everyone. Please tell me you're not going to do something crazy like quit your job or move to another state." I laughed. "No, nothing like that. But I am about to make a major business investment. Something that's going to change my life." "Rachel, you're scaring me. What kind of investment?" I told her about James Morrison's offer and my decision to buy Smoky Joe's. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Rachel, are you insane? You've never run a restaurant. You don't know anything about the food service industry." "Actually, I know more than you might think. I've been researching this for months. I know the profit margins, the operating costs, the staffing requirements. I've analyzed their financial statements, their customer demographics, their competition. This isn't a whim, Kelly. This is a calculated business decision." "But $2 million? That's your entire savings." "Not my entire savings. I'll still have a comfortable cushion after the purchase. And Kelly, this restaurant grosses nearly $4 million a year. Even with a conservative profit margin, I'll be making more money than I ever could working for someone else." We talked for another hour, with Kelly alternating between excitement and concern. She understood better than anyone what our father's constant criticism had done to my self-confidence over the years. She'd witnessed the slow erosion of my spirit during my marriage to Derek, and she'd watched me rebuild myself from scratch. "You know what?" she finally said. "I think you should do it. Dad has been telling you what you can't do your entire life. Maybe it's time to show him what you can do." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the evening reviewing every detail of the potential purchase. James had been transparent about the restaurant's financials, sharing 3 years of tax returns and monthly profit and loss statements. Smoky Joe's was profitable, but not spectacularly so. The margins were thin, as James had warned, but consistent. The building was in good condition, the equipment was well maintained, and the staff was experienced. More importantly, the restaurant had something money couldn't buy: a loyal customer base and a strong reputation in the community. James had built relationships with local farmers and suppliers, creating a network that would take years to replicate. The Sunday brunch crowd, the weekday lunch regulars, the families who celebrated milestones at Smoky Joe's, These were assets that didn't appear on any balance sheet. I made a list of changes I wanted to implement: updating the point-of-sale system, expanding the catering menu, possibly adding a small private dining room for special events. Nothing revolutionary, just thoughtful improvements that could increase revenue without alienating existing customers. By midnight, I'd created a comprehensive business plan, complete with financial projections and operational timelines. I'd also transferred the necessary funds from my investment accounts to my checking account, a process that would complete overnight. Tomorrow morning, I'd walk into the bank with the ability to write a check for $2 million. The woman my father had called broke just 8 hours earlier was about to become a business owner. The daughter he'd accused of having no ambition was about to take the biggest risk of her life. And the family member he'd said was, quote, wasting her life, was about to prove that sometimes the biggest successes come from the quietest preparations. I fell asleep that night with my laptop still open, dreaming of the look on Harold Brennan's face when he discovered that his unsuccessful daughter had just bought his favorite restaurant. The alarm went off at 6:30, but I'd been awake for an hour already, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing the conversation I was about to have with James Morrison. My stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror. In 3 hours, I would either be the proud owner of Smoky Joe's restaurant, or I would have made the biggest mistake of my life. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue blazer and matching slacks. Professional, but not overly formal. This wasn't a corporate boardroom meeting, but it was the most important business transaction of my life. My hands trembled slightly as I applied mascara, and I had to pause to steady myself. The woman in the mirror looked confident, composed, ready for anything. I hoped the facade would hold. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through the quiet morning streets of downtown. I'd banked there for 8 years, ever since moving back to town after my divorce. Margaret Chen, the branch manager, had helped me rebuild my credit and establish the investment accounts that were now about to make this purchase possible. She'd been expecting my call yesterday evening. "Rachel, I have to say, this is the most unusual transaction I've handled in 20 years of banking," Margaret said as she led me to her office. "Are you absolutely certain about this decision?" I nodded, though my heart was racing. "I've done my research, Margaret. I know the risks, but I also know the potential." She spread the paperwork across her desk. Wire transfer forms, cashier's check requests, loan documentation for the remaining balance. Even with my substantial savings, I'd need to finance a portion of the purchase to maintain adequate working capital for the restaurant's operations. "The loan committee approved your application yesterday afternoon," Margaret continued. "Your credit score is excellent, your debt-to-income ratio is outstanding, and frankly, your financial discipline over the past 3 years has been remarkable. You've built something impressive, Rachel." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a banking professional praising my financial acumen, less than 24 hours after my father had declared me broke and unsuccessful. I signed document after document, each signature bringing me closer to a reality I could barely comprehend. At 9:15, I drove to Morrison & Associates to hand in my resignation. The accounting firm had been my professional home for 6 years, and walking away felt like stepping off a cliff. But I'd already made arrangements for my consulting clients to be handled by other CPAs in the area. I owed it to them to ensure a smooth transition. Susan Morrison, the firm's managing partner, looked stunned when I explained my decision. "Rachel, you're one of our most reliable employees. This seems so sudden, so unlike you." "I know it seems impulsive," I replied, "but I've been planning this for longer than anyone realizes. I need to take this chance while I have it." She wished me luck and promised to provide excellent references if I ever needed them. I cleaned out my desk, packed my personal items into a cardboard box, and walked out of the building for the last time as someone else's employee. James Morrison was waiting for me at Smoky Joe's when I arrived at 10:30. The restaurant wouldn't open for lunch service for another hour, but the staff was already busy with prep work. The smell of onions sautéing and bread baking filled the air, and I felt a surge of possessive pride that caught me off guard. This was about to be my kitchen, my staff, my responsibility. "You look nervous," James observed as we shook hands. "Terrified would be more accurate," I admitted, "but good terrified, if that makes sense." He laughed. It makes perfect sense. I felt the same way when I bought this place 22 years ago. The previous owner was a crusty old German man named Otto, who'd run it for 30 years. He told me I was too young, too inexperienced, too optimistic, said I'd be bankrupt within 2 years. What happened? I proved him wrong, and you'll prove your doubters wrong too. We sat down at a corner table, the same one where I'd eaten countless solitary dinners over the past 2 years. James had brought his lawyer, a thin man named David Walsh, who specialized in business transactions. I'd hired my own attorney, Rebecca Santos, a sharp woman who'd handled my divorce and had been instrumental in protecting my assets during that difficult time. The negotiations were surprisingly straightforward. James had been honest about the restaurant's condition, its financials, and its potential challenges. He wasn't trying to inflate the value or hide problems. He genuinely wanted to see his life's work continue to thrive under new ownership. "There are a few things you should know," he said as we reviewed the final contracts. "Tuesday nights are always slow. You might want to consider doing something special to draw customers. The ice machine in the back kitchen has been acting up. It'll need to be replaced soon. And Carmen, the head chef, she's been with me for 12 years. She knows this place better than anyone. Don't change too much too quickly, or you'll lose her." I took notes on everything, grateful for his candor. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was a passing of the torch from one generation of restaurateur to another. At 11:45, we signed the final papers. I wrote a check for $2 million, the largest check I'd ever written by a factor of 10. James handed me a set of keys, including the old brass key to the front door that had been in his family since his grandfather's time. "Congratulations, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're now the owner of Smoky Joe's restaurant." I stared at the keys in my palm, feeling their weight. They were warm from James's hand, worn smooth by decades of use. These keys represented everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd dreamed of building. "There's something else," James added. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about wanting to make this work. I know I said I was ready to retire, but the truth is I'm not sure I'm ready to walk away completely. What would you say to keeping me on as a consultant for the first year? I could help with the transition, introduce you to suppliers, share some of the institutional knowledge that doesn't appear in any manual." It was a generous offer and exactly what I needed. "I'd love that, James. I was hoping you'd consider something like that." We shook hands again, and this time it felt different. We were no longer buyer and seller. We were partners in ensuring the restaurant's continued success. The lunch crowd began arriving at noon, and I watched from the kitchen as customers filed in, unaware that they were now dining in my establishment. The servers moved efficiently between tables, the kitchen staff called out orders, and the familiar rhythm of service began. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. I called my sister Kelly from the office, my office, to tell her the news. She screamed so loudly that Carmen looked up from her prep station with concern. "Rachel, I can't believe you actually did it. How do you feel?" "Like I'm gonna throw up," I answered honestly. "But also like I've finally done something that's completely mine." My phone had been buzzing with text messages all morning. My mother wanted to know if I'd made it to work safely after yesterday's unpleasantness. My cousin Marcus was apologizing for not speaking up during my father's tirade. Even my Aunt Patricia had sent a message saying she'd always believed I was capable of more than Harold gave me credit for. But there was nothing from my father. No follow-up to his harsh words. No acknowledgement of how his comments had affected me. That was typical Harold Brennan. He delivered his judgments and moved on, never considering the impact of his words on others. I spent the afternoon shadowing James as he handled the daily operations. I watched him interact with suppliers, mediate a minor dispute between two servers, and taste test the daily specials. The complexity of running a restaurant was overwhelming, but I was determined to learn everything I could. At 4 o'clock, I made a decision that would set the stage for everything that followed. I picked up my phone and composed a text message to my entire extended family, the same group that had witnessed my humiliation just 24 hours earlier. "Family dinner at Smoky Joe's tomorrow night, 6 p.m. My treat. I have an announcement to make." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Within minutes, my phone was buzzing with responses. Everyone wanted to know what was going on, but I kept my replies simple. "You'll find out tomorrow." The stage was set. Tomorrow evening, I would face my father across the same table where he'd called me broke and unsuccessful. But this time, I would be sitting there as the owner of the restaurant, the woman who'd turned his criticism into motivation, his doubt into determination. The girl he'd tried to diminish had become the businesswoman he'd never expected her to be. The 24 hours between buying Smokey Joe's and facing my family felt like the longest day of my life. I'd barely slept, my mind racing between excitement about my new venture and anxiety about the confrontation ahead. By 5:30 the next evening, I was already at the restaurant, pacing nervously in the back office while James finished his final preparations for what he didn't know would be his last service as the official owner. "You seem more nervous about dinner with your family than you did about buying a $2 million restaurant," Carmen observed, poking her head into the office. The head chef had worked late to prepare a special menu for my family gathering, though she still didn't know the real reason for the dinner. "Family dynamics are more complicated than business transactions," I replied, straightening my black dress for the third time. I'd chosen something elegant, but not flashy. I wanted to look successful without appearing to be showing off, though I supposed that ship had sailed the moment I'd invited everyone back to the scene of yesterday's humiliation. The first to arrive was my mother, of course. Linda Brennan had a pathological fear of being late, which meant she usually arrived everywhere 15 minutes early. She walked through the front door at exactly 5:45, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Rachel, sweetheart, what's all this about?" she asked, pulling me into one of her signature hugs that smelled like vanilla perfume and worry. "You were so mysterious in your text message. Your father's been grumbling about having to come back here 2 nights in a row." "Where is Dad?" I asked, scanning the parking lot through the window. "He'll be here. He's just finishing up a conference call with some client in California. You know how he is about his work." She paused, studying my face. "Honey, you look different. There's something in your eyes that wasn't there yesterday." Before I could respond, my sister Kelly burst through the door, having driven down from Seattle on a red-eye flight. She'd insisted on being here for what she called the most important moment of my sister's life, even though she had no idea what I was planning to reveal. "I can't believe I'm here," she said, embracing me tightly. "I haven't been this excited about family drama since cousin Jennifer got caught cheating on her SATs." My Aunt Patricia arrived next, followed by Uncle Bob and their son Danny. Then came Marcus and his fiancée Ashley, both looking slightly confused about why they'd been summoned back to the restaurant so soon after yesterday's engagement celebration. Jennifer showed up fashionably late, as always, checking her phone and complaining about traffic. At 6:15, my father finally arrived. Harold Brennan made an entrance the way other people made coffee, with ceremony and the expectation that everyone should pay attention. He wore his expensive navy suit, the one he reserved for important client meetings, and his expression suggested he considered this dinner an inconvenience rather than a family gathering. "Rachel," he said, nodding curtly in my direction, "I hope, whatever this announcement is, it's worth dragging everyone back here on a weeknight. Some of us have real work to do." I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had as a child when he'd review my report cards or critique my science fair projects. But something was different this time. Instead of shrinking under his disapproval, I felt myself standing taller. "Thank you all for coming," I said, addressing the group as they settled around the same table where yesterday's disaster had unfolded. "I know this seems sudden, but I have some news to share, and I wanted to tell everyone at once." Destiny, the purple-haired hostess, had discreetly moved other diners to different sections of the restaurant, giving us privacy for whatever family drama was about to unfold. The servers had been briefed to give us space, unless we specifically requested something. "Before we order," I continued, my voice steadier than I felt, "I want to share something with all of you. Something that's been in the works for a while but came together very quickly after our dinner yesterday." My father checked his watch impatiently. "Rachel, just get to the point. What's this big announcement?" I took a deep breath, looked around the table at the faces of my family, some curious, some concerned, some already looking bored, and made my decision. I bought this restaurant. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer's fork clattered against her water glass. Marcus's mouth fell open. Uncle Bob blinked rapidly as if he was processing a complex mathematical equation. My mother's hand flew to her chest. "What do you mean, you bought it?" my father asked, his voice carrying that tone he used when he thought someone was playing a practical joke on him. "I mean exactly what I said. Yesterday morning I contacted James Morrison, the owner of Smoky Joe's. We met, negotiated terms, and I purchased the restaurant for $2 million. As of 11:45 yesterday morning, I am the sole owner of this establishment." My cousin Danny started laughing, not because he found it funny, but because he was nervous and didn't know how else to react. "Come on, Rachel, be serious. You can't just buy a restaurant overnight." "Actually, you can," I replied calmly, "when you have the financial resources and the business plan to support it." My father's face was cycling through several colors: confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Rachel, this is ridiculous. Yesterday you were complaining about your little apartment and your old car. You can't possibly have $2 million. Dad, I wasn't complaining about anything yesterday. You were criticizing my lifestyle choices. There's a difference." I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of the signed purchase agreement. "This is the contract. Would you like to see the bank transfer receipts as well?" The table erupted in overlapping conversations. Kelly was beaming with pride, having already known about the purchase. My mother was asking a dozen questions at once about financing and business plans and whether I'd lost my mind. Patricia was demanding to know why I'd been hiding money from the family. Marcus was trying to calculate the logistics of running a restaurant while Ashley sat in stunned silence. But my father wasn't talking. He was staring at the purchase agreement on my phone screen, his jaw working as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "How?" he finally asked. "How is this possible? You work at a small accounting firm. You live in a tiny apartment. You drive a car that's 7 years old." "I work at a small accounting firm by choice," I corrected. "I live in a modest apartment because I don't need to impress anyone with my address. And I drive a reliable car because I'd rather invest my money than waste it on depreciating assets." The truth began pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. I told them about my consulting business, about the clients I'd built up over 3 years of working evenings and weekends. I explained how I'd lived below my means, investing every spare dollar in a carefully diversified portfolio. I described the research I'd done on the restaurant industry, the business plan I'd developed, the relationships I'd cultivated with suppliers and staff. "For 3 years I've been building something," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "While you all assumed I was failing, I was actually creating exactly the life I wanted. Not the life you thought I should want, Dad, but the life that made sense for my goals and my values." Jennifer found her voice first. "But Rachel, why didn't you tell anyone? Why let us all think you were struggling?" "Because I wasn't struggling. You all just assumed I was because my success didn't look like what you expected success to look like." My father was still processing, his business mind clearly trying to reconcile what he'd assumed about my financial situation with the reality I was presenting. "You're telling me you've had millions of dollars this entire time?" "Not millions, plural. But yes, I've been financially secure for quite some time now. The consulting business I built generates 6 figures annually, on top of my regular salary. I've been investing consistently and living well below my means. Yesterday, when you called me broke and unsuccessful, I had enough liquid assets to buy this restaurant and still maintain a substantial emergency fund." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Here we were, sitting in the exact same spot where my father had lectured me about my lack of ambition and financial failure, and I was revealing that I'd just purchased the building around us. Uncle Bob was the first to recover from the shock. "Rachel, this is incredible. But are you sure you know what you're getting into? Running a restaurant is incredibly challenging." "I'm aware of the challenges," I replied. "I've spent months researching the industry, analyzing this specific restaurant's performance, and developing operational improvements. James Morrison has agreed to stay on as a consultant for the first year to help with the transition." "James knows about this?" my mother asked. "Mom, James is the one I bought it from. We've been discussing this possibility for months." My father finally found his voice again, though it sounded different than usual. Smaller somehow. "Rachel, I don't understand." If you had this kind of money, this kind of business acumen, why didn't you ever say anything?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the restaurant's grill. It was the crux of everything. The years of criticism, the constant undermining, the assumptions about my capabilities based on external appearances rather than actual accomplishments. "Dad, when would I have said something? During one of your lectures about my poor life choices? While you were telling me I had no ambition? When you were comparing me unfavorably to everyone else at this table?" I kept my voice level, but I could feel years of suppressed frustration bleeding through. "You never asked about my goals or my plans. You just assumed that because my lifestyle didn't match your definition of success, I must be failing." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Ashley, Marcus's fiancée, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. This was only her third time meeting our family, and she was witnessing what was probably our most dramatic confrontation ever. Carmen appeared at our table, having sensed that the family meeting had reached a natural pause. "Excuse me, but would you like to hear about tonight's specials? We have a beautiful Atlantic salmon with lemon herb butter and our chef's signature barbecue ribs with house-made sauce." I looked around the table at my family, some still stunned, others beginning to smile with what looked like pride. My father still processing the complete reversal of his assumptions about my life. "Actually, Carmen," I said, standing up from the table, "I'd like everyone to meet the head chef and kitchen manager of my restaurant. Carmen Rodriguez has been with Smoky Joe's for 12 years, and she's one of the main reasons this establishment has maintained its excellent reputation." Carmen's eyes widened as she realized what I'd just said. "Your restaurant?" "As of yesterday morning, yes. I'm the new owner, and I hope you'll stay on as we transition to new management." A slow smile spread across Carmen's face. "Well, I'll be damned. James said he was selling to someone special, but he didn't tell me it was you. Congratulations, boss." The word boss seemed to hit my father like a physical blow. His daughter, the one he'd called broke and unsuccessful just 24 hours earlier, was now being addressed with the kind of respect and authority he'd always assumed she'd never achieve. As Carmen returned to the kitchen to prepare our orders, I sat back down and looked directly at my father. "Dad, I know this is a lot to process. I know it challenges everything you thought you knew about my situation, but I need you to understand something. I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did this because it was the right move for my career and my future. The fact that it happens to contradict your assessment of my capabilities is just a bonus." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. And I'm so sorry if we ever made you feel like you couldn't share your successes with us." Kelly raised her water glass in a toast. "To my sister Rachel, who just pulled off the most epic comeback in family history." One by one, the others joined the toast, even my father, though his participation seemed more automatic than enthusiastic. As we clinked glasses, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The dinner that followed was unlike any family gathering we'd ever had. Instead of my father dominating the conversation with his opinions and critiques, people were asking me questions about my business plans, my vision for the restaurant, my thoughts on the industry. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one with expertise, the one with accomplishments worth discussing. But the most satisfying moment came at the end of the evening, when the check arrived. My father, out of habit, reached for it as he always did. I gently intercepted his hand. "The one Pritia Huasaini." "Dad, this one's on the house," I said with a smile. "Owner's prerogative." The look on Harold Brennan's face, a mixture of pride, bewilderment, and perhaps a touch of humility, was worth every dollar I'd invested in making this moment possible. 3 months later, I stood in the same spot where my father had humiliated me, but everything had changed. The dinner rush was in full swing, servers weaving between tables with practiced efficiency, and the sound of satisfied customers filled the air. Smoky Joe's was thriving under my ownership, and the improvements I'd implemented were already showing results in both customer satisfaction and revenue. The morning after our family dinner revelation, my phone had started ringing at 6 a.m. Word travels fast in a small town, and by noon, half the community knew that Harold Brennan's unsuccessful daughter had purchased one of the most popular restaurants in the area. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on my father's business associates. several of whom had witnessed his criticism of my life choices at various social gatherings over the years. My first major decision as owner had been to expand the weekend brunch menu and extend operating hours on Sundays. The research I'd done showed a gap in the local market for upscale brunch options, and Carmen had been eager to showcase her culinary creativity beyond the traditional barbecue fare. We'd added items like duck confit hash, bourbon maple French toast, and a build-your-own Bloody Mary bar that had become the talk of the town. The Tuesday night problem James had warned me about was solved with Trivia Tuesday, a weekly event that packed the restaurant with young professionals and college students. We'd also launched a catering division, leveraging Carmen's skills and the restaurant's reputation to serve corporate events and private parties. Within 2 months, catering was generating 15% of our total revenue. But the most significant change wasn't visible to customers. It was the shift in my relationship with my family, particularly my father. The week after the revelation dinner, he'd shown up at the restaurant unannounced during the lunch rush. I'd found him sitting at the bar, nursing a coffee and watching the controlled chaos of service with what looked like fascination. "I've been thinking about what you said," he'd begun without preamble, "about success not looking the way I expected it to look." I joined him at the bar, still wearing my chef's coat after spending the morning learning inventory management from Carmen. "Dad, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Rachel, I spent your entire childhood trying to teach you to be ambitious, to strive for more, to never settle for mediocrity. But somewhere along the way, I confused external validation with actual achievement. I looked at your apartment, your car, your job title, and I assumed those things reflected your capabilities rather than your choices. It was the closest thing to an apology Harold Brennan had ever offered anyone in my memory. I appreciate that, Dad. I've been talking to some colleagues about restaurant investments," he'd continued. "The margins in this industry are notoriously thin. The failure rate is astronomical, and the workload is brutal. What you've done here, not just buying the place, but having the vision and financial acumen to make it work. It's impressive. More than impressive. It's exactly the kind of calculated risk-taking I always hoped you'd develop." That conversation had marked the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. My father began stopping by regularly, not to criticize or offer unsolicited advice, but to observe and learn. He'd watch me negotiate with suppliers, review financial reports, and handle staffing challenges with genuine interest rather than judgment. The changes weren't limited to my immediate family. Word of my success had spread through my father's professional network, and I'd started receiving inquiries from other business owners who wanted to discuss potential partnerships or seek advice on their own ventures. The woman who'd been dismissed as financially incompetent was now being consulted as a business strategist. My consulting practice had evolved as well. Instead of working evenings and weekends for small clients, I was now being approached by established businesses that needed help with expansion planning, financial restructuring, and operational efficiency. The restaurant had become an inadvertent showcase for my business skills, proving that I could not only analyze other people's operations but successfully manage my own. Kelly had visited twice since the revelation dinner, bringing her husband and kids to see, quote, Aunt Rachel's restaurant. My nephews, 8 and 10 years old, had been fascinated by the kitchen operations and had spent an entire afternoon following Carmen around, asking questions about cooking techniques and restaurant management. Kelly had pulled me aside during their last visit with tears in her eyes. "Rachel, I need to tell you something," she'd said as we watched her boys help Carmen prep vegetables for the evening service. "Growing up, I always felt sorry for you because Dad was so hard on you. I thought he was damaging your self-confidence, making you afraid to take risks. But now I realize he wasn't damaging you. He was tempering you, like steel in a forge. All that criticism, all those challenges to prove yourself, they made you stronger and more determined than the rest of us." She wasn't wrong. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about my limitations, every comparison to more successful family members had added fuel to a fire I'd kept carefully banked for years. When the moment came to make my move, that accumulated energy had been ready to explode into action. The financial results spoke for themselves. In 3 months of ownership, I'd increased monthly revenue by 22% while reducing food costs through better supplier relationships and inventory management. Customer satisfaction scores had improved across all categories, and we'd received our first review from the regional food critic, 4 stars, and a glowing write-up that mentioned the restaurant's innovative evolution under new ownership. More importantly, I'd retained every member of the existing staff while adding 3 new positions. Carmen had been promoted to executive chef with a substantial raise and profit-sharing arrangement. The servers were earning more through increased business and improved tip percentages. Even James Morrison, who'd stayed on as promised, seemed energized by the changes rather than threatened by them. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There were sleepless nights when equipment broke down, stressful days when key staff called in sick during busy periods, and constant decisions about everything from menu pricing to marketing strategies. But each challenge overcome felt like validation of my decision to take this enormous risk. My personal life had changed dramatically as well. The modest apartment I'd defended to my father was no longer adequate for my needs. I'd purchased a 3-bedroom house in the historic district, close enough to the restaurant for quick commutes but far enough away to maintain some separation between work and home. The house had character, built in 1925, with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that I'd renovated with professional-grade appliances. The Honda Civic, which had been the subject of so much criticism, had been joined by a used BMW X5 that I'd bought from a customer who was relocating. It wasn't new or flashy, but it was reliable and spacious enough to transport restaurant supplies when needed. More importantly, I'd bought it with cash, maintaining my philosophy of avoiding unnecessary debt. Dating had become interesting in unexpected ways. My success as a business owner seemed to attract a different caliber of men, professionals who were impressed by entrepreneurial achievement rather than intimidated by it. I'd started seeing David Chen, Margaret's nephew and a successful architect who'd initially approached me about designing a private dining room addition to the restaurant. Our relationship was still new, but it was built on mutual respect and shared professional ambitions rather than financial dependence or emotional neediness. The 6-month mark since purchasing Smoky Joe's coincided with my 33rd birthday, and my family had insisted on celebrating at the restaurant. But this gathering was nothing like the engagement party that had started everything. This time, I was the one being honored, the one whose achievements were being celebrated. My father stood up during dessert to make a toast, something he'd never done for me before. 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about my daughter's capabilities and limitations. I was wrong about almost everything. He paused, looking directly at me with what might have been admiration. Rachel, you've built something remarkable here. Not just a successful business, but a demonstration of vision, determination, and strategic thinking that I frankly didn't know you possessed. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize what you were accomplishing. The toast was followed by a surprise that nearly brought me to tears. Carmen wheeled out a custom cake she'd designed, a replica of the restaurant's exterior, complete with the new sign I'd commissioned. Smoky Joe's, under new management since 2025, was written in elegant script across the base, but the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. James Morrison, who'd been quietly enjoying his retirement while occasionally consulting on restaurant operations, approached me as the evening wound down. "Rachel, I have a proposition for you," he said with a smile that suggested he'd been planning this for a while. "My brother-in-law owns a struggling steakhouse in the next county. He's been thinking about selling, but he's not sure it's worth anything to potential buyers. Would you be interested in taking a look? I think you might see possibilities that others would miss." The idea of expanding into a second location was both thrilling and terrifying. 6 months ago, I'd been working for someone else, living in a small apartment and enduring family criticism about my lack of ambition. Now I was being approached about acquiring a second restaurant, leveraging the success of my first venture into a potential empire. "Tell me more," I said, pulling out my phone to take notes. The familiar excitement of a new business opportunity was already building in my chest. As my family gathered their things and prepared to leave, I walked through the restaurant one more time, checking on the evening's final customers and ensuring everything was ready for tomorrow's service. The dining room was nearly empty now, just a few couples lingering over coffee and dessert. I paused at the same table where my father had delivered his crushing assessment of my life just 6 months earlier. The memory seemed both distant and immediate. Distant because so much had changed. Immediate because it had been the catalyst for everything that followed. My phone buzzed with a text from Kelly. "Still can't believe you actually did it. Dad hasn't stopped bragging about your success to his golf buddies. Pretty sure he's taking credit for motivating you to achieve greatness." I laughed out loud, startling a nearby server who was clearing tables. Of course, my father would find a way to make my success about his parenting strategy. But for once, his need to take credit didn't bother me. Let him tell his friends whatever version of the story made him feel better. I knew the truth, that I'd succeeded not because of his criticism, but in spite of it. The truth was simpler and more powerful than any story he could tell. Sometimes the people who believe in you least give you the greatest motivation to prove them wrong. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success so complete and undeniable that it speaks for itself. As I locked the doors of my restaurant and headed home to my house, driving my reliable car past the life I'd built through determination and careful planning, I realized that this was just the beginning. The girl who'd been called broke and unsuccessful had become a woman who bought restaurants, and that woman was ready to see what she could accomplish next. 1 year later, I found myself standing in the conference room of Patterson and Associates, the largest commercial real estate firm in the Tri-County area. Spread across the mahogany table were architectural blueprints, financial projections, and lease agreements for what would become my third restaurant location. The struggling steakhouse James had mentioned had become the Copper Kitchen, a farm-to-table establishment that had exceeded all revenue projections within 6 months of opening. Now I was preparing to expand into the city market with a concept that would challenge everything people thought they knew about fine dining. Ms. Brennan, based on these numbers, you're looking at a total investment of approximately $12 million, said Victoria Patterson, the firm's senior partner. That includes property acquisition, renovations, equipment, and working capital for the first year of operations. Are you comfortable with that level of exposure? I smiled, remembering a time when my father thought I couldn't afford a decent car. Victoria, I'm comfortable with calculated risks. This isn't exposure, it's expansion. The meeting had been scheduled for 2 o'clock, but I'd arrived early to review the final contracts one more time. The property was a historic building in the downtown Arts District, a former textile factory that had been converted into a mixed-use development. The restaurant space occupied the entire ground floor, with soaring ceilings, exposed brick walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. My vision for Meridian was ambitious. A 50-table restaurant featuring locally sourced ingredients, an open kitchen concept, and a wine program that would rival establishments in major metropolitan areas. But what set it apart wasn't just the food or atmosphere, it was the business model. Meridian would be the first restaurant in the region to operate as a cooperative, with key staff members holding equity stakes and sharing in the profits. Carmen had been instrumental in developing this concept. After 18 months of working together, she'd become more than just my executive chef. She was my business partner and closest advisor. Her culinary expertise, combined with my financial acumen, had created a partnership that elevated both of our careers beyond what either of us could have achieved alone. The cooperative model is risky, Victoria continued, shuffling through the legal documents. You're essentially giving up partial control of your business in exchange for employee investment and commitment. I'm not giving up control, I corrected. I'm sharing ownership with the people who make success possible. Carmen will own 15% of Meridian. Our sommelier will hold 8%, and the general manager will have 5%. These aren't employees. They're stakeholders with skin in the game. The idea had come to me during a particularly challenging week at Smoky Joe's, when 2 servers had quit without notice, leaving us short-staffed during the busy season. Traditional restaurants treated staff as replaceable resources, but I'd learned that exceptional people were the foundation of exceptional businesses. By offering equity stakes to key personnel, I was ensuring their commitment while creating a sustainable model for growth. My phone buzzed with a text from David, my architect boyfriend who'd become my partner in more ways than one. Board meeting finished early. Want to grab lunch before your Patterson meeting? Our relationship had evolved naturally, from professional collaboration to personal partnership. He understood the demands of running a business because he was building his own architectural practice, and our shared ambition created a foundation that felt more solid than anything I'd experienced in my marriage. I texted back, already at Patterson's, dinner tonight to celebrate? I think we're about to close on Meridian. The negotiations with Patterson and Associates had been ongoing for 3 months. The property was prime real estate, and I wasn't the only interested party. A national chain restaurant had made an offer, as had a local developer who wanted to convert the space into luxury condominiums. But I'd had an advantage they didn't: a proven track record of success and a compelling vision for how the space could contribute to the neighborhood's revitalization. My success with the Copper Kitchen had been the deciding factor. The steakhouse James's brother-in-law had been ready to abandon had become a destination restaurant within 8 months of my takeover. By implementing the same strategies that had worked at Smoky Joe's: staff development, menu innovation, and community engagement, we transformed a failing business into a profitable enterprise that employed 32 people and generated annual revenue of $2.8 million. The local business journal had featured me on their cover 3 months ago with the headline, "The Restaurant Whisperer: How Rachel Brennan Transforms Failing Eateries into Profitable Enterprises." The article had led to consulting requests from restaurant owners across the region, and I'd started charging substantial fees for business transformation services. But success had also brought unexpected challenges. The higher my profile became, the more scrutiny I faced from competitors and critics who questioned whether my rapid expansion was sustainable. Some industry veterans suggested I was moving too fast, taking on too much debt, risking everything I'd built for the sake of growth. Victoria finished reviewing the contracts and looked up with a satisfied expression. "Everything appears to be in order. The sellers have accepted your final offer, pending board approval from their investment group. Assuming that goes through, and I have no reason to think it won't, we can schedule the closing for next Friday." As I signed the preliminary agreements, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since that humiliating family dinner 18 months ago. The woman who'd been called broke and unsuccessful now had a business portfolio worth over $8 million. I employed more than 60 people across 3 establishments, had been invited to speak at restaurant industry conferences, and was being courted by investors who wanted to fund my expansion into new markets. The transformation hadn't just been financial. My relationship with my family had continued to evolve in ways I never could have anticipated. My father, who'd once criticized my lack of ambition, now bragged about my achievements to anyone who would listen. He'd even started bringing his business associates to my restaurants, treating them like his personal discoveries. Last month, he'd surprised me by asking if I'd be interested in partnering with him on a real estate investment. "Rachel, you understand business fundamentals better than most people I know," he'd said. "I'd value your input on this project." It was the first time Harold Brennan had ever sought my professional opinion, and the moment had felt more significant than any apology could have been. My mother had become one of my biggest supporters, organizing family gatherings at whichever restaurant needed the business boost, and recommending my establishments to her extensive social network. She'd also started helping with administrative tasks during busy periods, discovering a talent for customer service that she'd never had the opportunity to develop during her years as a traditional housewife. Kelly had moved back from Seattle 6 months ago when her husband's company relocated their West Coast operations. She'd taken a position as my marketing director, bringing her corporate communications experience to help build brand recognition for all 3 restaurants. Working together had strengthened our relationship and given her a career opportunity she'd never had while living in her husband's shadow. Even the extended family dynamics had shifted. Cousin Marcus, who'd once been held up as the example of success I should emulate, now sought my advice about expanding his food truck business. Jennifer had asked me to cater her company's annual retreat, and Uncle Bob had invested in the Copper Kitchen as a silent partner. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how I saw myself. The woman who'd once apologized for her modest lifestyle now owned it completely. I drove a sensible car because I prioritized substance over flash. I lived in a comfortable house because it met my needs without exceeding them. I made business decisions based on data and strategy, rather than ego or external validation. Victoria gathered the contracts and placed them in a leather portfolio. "Congratulations, Rachel. Meridian is going to be an incredible addition to the downtown district. When are you planning to open?" "We're targeting spring of next year," I replied. "The renovations will take 4 months, staff training another 6 weeks, and we want to soft open with limited seating before the full launch." "That's ambitious given the scope of the project." I've learned that ambitious goals require ambitious timelines. If you give yourself too much time to second-guess your decisions, you'll talk yourself out of taking necessary risks. As I left the Patterson and Associates building, I felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with embarking on a new venture. Meridian represented more than just another restaurant. It was proof that the success of Smoky Joe's and the Copper Kitchen hadn't been accidents or luck. I had developed a systematic approach to restaurant management that could be replicated and scaled. My phone rang as I walked to my car. The caller ID showed James Morrison's name, and I answered with a smile. Despite officially retiring, James had remained actively involved in my business ventures, serving as an informal mentor and trusted advisor. "Rachel, I just heard about Meridian through the restaurant supply network," he said. $12 million for a downtown location? You've come a long way from the nervous woman who called me from a family dinner. It feels surreal sometimes, I admitted. 18 months ago, I was afraid to tell my family about my consulting business. Now I'm about to open my third restaurant with a business model that doesn't exist anywhere else in the region. That's because you're not just running restaurants, James observed. You're innovating within the industry. The cooperative ownership structure, the community engagement initiatives, the staff development programs, you're changing how people think about restaurant operations. He wasn't wrong. Each of my establishments had become a case study in sustainable business practices. We offered health insurance to all full-time employees, paid above minimum wage, and provided advancement opportunities that kept our turnover rates well below industry averages. The result was better service, higher customer satisfaction, and stronger financial performance. "James, I need to ask you something," I said, leaning against my car in the parking garage. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my father hadn't humiliated me that day? If he'd been supportive instead of critical?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Rachel, I think you would have succeeded eventually, but it might have taken longer. Sometimes we need someone to tell us we can't do something before we realize how badly we want to prove them wrong." That evening, David and I celebrated the Meridian deal at a small Italian restaurant across town from my establishments. It was one of our traditions. When we had something significant to celebrate, we went somewhere neutral where I could relax without constantly monitoring service and operations. "So what's next?" David asked as we shared a bottle of Chianti. "After Meridian opens and proves that cooperative restaurants can work, what's the next mountain you want to climb?" I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The obvious answer was continued expansion. More restaurants, new markets, franchising opportunities. But I was beginning to realize that my real passion wasn't just running restaurants. It was transforming struggling businesses and proving that sustainable practices could be profitable. "I think I want to start a consulting firm," I said. "Not just for restaurants, but for any small business that's struggling with operations, staffing, or financial management. I want to teach other entrepreneurs how to build something sustainable instead of just something that looks successful from the outside." David smiled and raised his glass. "To Rachel Brennan, the woman who bought a restaurant to prove her father wrong and ended up revolutionizing an entire industry." As we clinked glasses, I thought about how much truth there was in that toast. What had started as a moment of wounded pride had evolved into a career that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible. The girl who'd been told she was broke and unsuccessful had become a woman who created opportunities for others to succeed. But the most satisfying part wasn't the financial success or industry recognition. It was the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful, something that would continue growing and creating value long after I was gone. The restaurants weren't just businesses. They were communities where employees could build careers, customers could create memories, and suppliers could find reliable partnerships. 6 months from now, when Meridian opened its doors for the first time, I would be standing in a restaurant I'd designed from the ground up, watching a staff I'd hired and trained serve customers who'd come to experience something unique and special. And somewhere in the dining room, probably complaining about the noise level or the price of wine, my father would be sitting with his friends, telling them how proud he was of his daughter's accomplishments. The irony would never stop being amusing. The man who'd told me I had no ambition had inadvertently created the catalyst for achievements that surpassed anything he'd accomplished in his own career. Sometimes the best gift someone can give you is their complete lack of faith in your abilities. It forces you to prove not just them wrong, but yourself right. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.